But one thing we also talked about yesterday that I'm interested in is on the football side of things, Donaven McCulley, quarterback, former quarterback, moving to wide receiver for Tom Allen's Hoosiers. We haven't seen, this isn't obviously a very uncommon thing, specifically with smaller teams like Indiana, who tend to not always get the biggest quarterbacks out of recruiting. So it's not necessarily out of left field that this is happening, especially when you have somebody like Connor Bazelak from Missouri coming in, who is poised to be a contender for the starting job in the fall. And then you still have Jack Tuttle, who has that starting experience for Indiana. So it's not, I mean, and I know we've had, or Donaven McCulley's had experience from last season, kind of forced experience dealing with all of the injuries, but his size is not necessarily really something to, I guess, write home about when it comes to some of the other quarterbacks, especially the elite quarterbacks in the Big Ten.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about Donovan is just his overall athletic ability and the fact that he's 6'5", he's a big target. He's a guy that, I said Don Fisher compared him to James Hardy, who, went on to the NFL and tragically passed away at 31. In terms of Indiana having that kind of big target. I mean, they've had some big targets, certainly at tight end, the Peyton Hendershot. This year, A.J. Barner, I know they're very high on at the tight end position. But to have that wide receiver target, that's 6'5", that could play pretty well in the Big Ten. And he's a fast kid, too. He's a good athlete. I think you'll still see him in some wildcat formations near the goal line. I don't think that'll change. I think they'll run plays for him, and I think you'll see him as a receiver that could be kind of like a hybrid, and you could pitch the ball to as well because he's such a good runner. But it's interesting. What struck me about Donovan was, as a true freshman, he was thrown into a tough situation. He didn't have spring football because he played for Lawrence North. He played basketball. It's what he wanted to do. But what really struck me about his struggles as a quarterback was just his accuracy. I mean, he just 41%. He just did not have the accuracy, particularly on the short and intermediate route. I mean, he threw a nice deep ball. And if you remember that Maryland game last year, I mean, he threw for 260 yards. He had some moments where he threw the ball pretty well. I'm a little surprised he didn't stick with it at quarterback and just was patient. But maybe I think he feels like maybe this is a quicker way to get on the field, and maybe this will be better down the road for my NFL hopes because he's definitely got the athletic ability. And, you've got Connor Bazelak next year. You've got Jack Tuttle. You also have Dexter Williams, who is back from torn ACL, who's another athletic quarterback type, that dual threat type. The kid coming in, Brendan Sorsby, is another dual threat type quarterback. So I think you still got some good depth there. Grant Gremmel, the walk-on from Noblesville, showed a lot, I think, last year too. He'll be in the mix, I think, for playing time if people get injured. So I still think you're deep enough at that quarterback spot where this could work.
Yeah, especially because you have other wide receivers coming in as well. I'd say probably the biggest name out of the transfer portal, Emory Simmons from North Carolina. He was once an Indiana recruit that never came to fruition. He obviously went to the ACC, but coming back to where he was, or one of his original, is he from the state of Indiana? Does he play high school football?
No, he's from North Carolina.
He's from North Carolina.
That's what factored into his decision to flip, was the fact that he wanted to stay close to home. When we talked to him in March, he talked about that, about not wanting to go someplace too far from home. But now how that has changed because of the fact that in North Carolina, he felt like he wasn't necessarily getting the snaps that he wanted to get, and this would present an opportunity for a little more playing time here in Indiana. So he's going to get a chance to do something. You remember Cam Camper, the kid from the junior college transfer from Texas? They're very high on him. And they're keeping their fingers crossed that DJ Matthews will be back from the torn ACL. Now, you never know, right? You saw what happened with Michael Penix last year.
Exactly. Everybody thought that Michael Penix was going to be back and 100% ready to go, and he was a completely different player last season. And you can blame that on numerous things. The offensive line primarily is what a lot of people had issues with last season. But at the same time, it's hard to think. You could probably count on maybe even one hand, at least for me, someone my age, successful players who have come back from a torn ACL and still been successful.
Yeah. Well, what's crazy to think about with Michael Penix is, when he came back from the first ACL, he was pretty good in 2019. He had a pretty good season, and then it carried over into 2020, where he had the real breakout season. But then, second one is really problematic. And then in Indiana, the kick returner, right, Ja'Shawn Harris, had 3 of them, and came back from 3 of them, which is so I believe this is the first for DJ Matthews. So maybe you keep your fingers crossed and you hope that he has a Penix-like recovery on the first one and it comes back and he's productive. I know they're high on him, but McCulley presents more insurance, a little more depth at that wide receiver spot where you can have a guy that comes in and plays pretty well. And there's some other transfers that'll be in the mix as well. And I know Jalen Lucas is an incoming freshman who could be a hybrid, who could play some wide receiver and some running back as well, and maybe play in the slot a little bit too. That could be helpful as well.
Another interesting thing on the football end, you have which one of the McCulloughs is it? Is it Dave McCullough, decommitted from Indiana not too long ago, but Dason McCullough, the one a part of this current class, is firmly planting his feet in Bloomington. I'm curious if he's just kind of waiting it out a season to see if it's really going to be worth it now that he won't have his younger brother with him. His dad's no longer going to be on the coaching staff, obviously. But he's still the highest rated player in this 2022 recruiting class. So you'd think that the reason for him wanting to stay, not only because of who recruited him, but thinking he can make an immediate impact and raise his own draft stock by being somebody who can get on the field early and often.
Yeah, whereas maybe if you go to Notre Dame, maybe the position battles there are a little different. But that being said, I think Dason was set back a little bit. He had some injury issues in the spring. I know that. But then he came on kind of later in the spring and did some things. I think he projects as kind of maybe at that Husky spot or which is up for grabs. I think he would be maybe he's a little small for the bull position, but I thought he would be suited for that too because he's just a really good pass rusher. He's so athletic and he's got such a really good wingspan as well. But as an edge rusher or maybe as a Husky, he'll make that impact. You never know with him or maybe not. And maybe he'll just say after 1 year, hey, look, I'll join my dad at Notre Dame. So we'll see. We'll see how things transpire. But I mean, watching that kid in a high school game, Bloomington South against Martinsville last year, I mean, he was a dominating force in that game.
Well, and that's the thing. He, instead of decommitting and going to Notre Dame now that you have this transfer portal rule where you can do the one-time transfer, why not go ahead and stick with where you're at and see how things might be? Because you still have that option to go away if you don't like the fit there. Now, a lot of people don't like that because it gives people a way to just back out of a situation that may not have been ideal. But at the same time, it is good for the players who may not have been getting what they asked for or signed up what they asked for at the same time.
Yeah, I think that, it's player movement is I think it's okay. But I do think, too, that I kind of like the old way that you sat out a year. And the reason why that rule was in place also, there's an academic component to it because when you transfer credits, it's sometimes hard to get all those credits to carry over and you get caught back up academically. Now you're not having that as much. But I think that it'll be interesting, John, to see how things play out here for Dason McCulley because he certainly is a tremendous talent and he's a guy that you would like to keep here in this recruiting class. They already lost to Brian Payne to Notre Dame, which was a blow to that recruiting class as well. Another 4-star that left. So you want that this is supposed to be the best recruiting class in Indiana history, something that you can build around 3-4 years down the road, hopefully if they all stick around. So like to see Dason McCullough be a part of that.
It really feels like too that going into this season after the letdown that was, and that's kind of an understatement too, the letdown that was last year, it really feels like all of the momentum that Tom Allen has put together really comes down to this season if you're going to be able to maintain it or not. If you lay another egg, and I'm not even sure really what the true expectations are yet for this season, because if you ask anyone, Even people here on Indiana Sports Beat, some people will say that they only expect 2 wins again. Some people say 4. Some people say 6. When you haven't seen anything, when you have a brand new offensive coordinator, Walt Bell, and a new defensive coordinator because Charlton Warren left, and you haven't had an open spring practice, you have a brand new quarterback, you have mostly brand new wide receivers. There's so much unknown. It's almost like this is a brand new team entirely coming into the season. So all people have to go off of is what happened back in 2021.
Yeah, and don't forget 2021. I mean, it was an injury-filled season, and sometimes that has, that there's a luck component to it. There's a keeping healthy component to it. I think the injury, a lot of people talk about, obviously the Penix injury was huge, and the fact that even when he did come back, he didn't look the same. But I think the injury that was not talked about enough that really impacted them, particularly on the defensive side of the ball, particularly from October on, was Tywone Mullen going down because of the fact that, you could not play in the secondary the way you could play in previous years because Tywone Mullen was an island. And I think that really hurt them. It hurt their big playability in the secondary. The fact that they went from having, the most interceptions in the Big Ten in 2020 with 16 to the fewest with 5. I think a lot of that had to do with Tywone Mullen being out. So you got to keep him healthy. I talked to Tom Allen about that in the spring. He said he expects him to be fully healthy, ready to go. He's your only All-American back from that 2020 team because Micah McFadden left. He's your most talented guy. So he's going to have to be, I think, the guy. And I think that first game against Illinois, Friday night here is so huge because it's a winnable game. But Illinois has, gained some momentum under Brett Bielema, and football is such a momentum sport, right? I think if you win that game, then you've got, the 2 non-conference, Idaho and Western Kentucky. Then you could be 3-0 going down to Cincinnati, facing a Cincinnati team that was obviously in the Final Four last year, but lost so much talent from that team.
Mm-hmm.
Ritter and Sauce Gardner, who's with my Jets. Very happy about that. Maybe could be the next Revis, fingers crossed, right? Pierce, the wide receivers with the Colts. They had a lot of time. I think Ford. They had, I was watching the NFL draft, and they must have like 8 to 10 players from that Cincinnati team taken in the draft. So that's got to take a hit on Cincinnati's talent level. But you got to go down there as well. It's going to be a lot harder, but it'll be a different Cincinnati team that they face this season in late September.
Back to that Illinois game real quick because we're going to be going to break, and it looks like Jim's going to be joining us starting the next segment. But you mentioned how big that Illinois game is. Illinois is going to be coming off a week 0 matchup against Wyoming to start the season. But
the Cowboys.
So they'll have that first game under their belts. But they're going to be going into an Indiana team who they know absolutely nothing about. They have 0 film to watch except for from last season. But what good is that going to do for you whenever you have a totally different offensive system, a new defensive coordinator, a new quarterback? I mentioned all this earlier, but there's a lot of things playing into Indiana's favor in that opening Friday night game.
Yeah, and it's always fascinating, right? With the first game, it's like rest versus rust. Like how will that impact? Could Illinois be nicked up going to that game? Could they have an injury or two? That hurts them, or will they be playing in more of a rhythm than an Indiana team that'll be playing their first game under a new offensive coordinator, under a new defensive coordinator? And that's the thing in college football. Why I covered Florida for so many years, where they, played these first 2 guarantee games against Southwest Louisiana or whatever, or New Mexico, and people would say, "Well, why do you do that?" And the response that I often got off the record is, "There's no preseason in college football." So, but the way the Big Ten does it, bam, you're in a conference game right away. They create those marquee matchups early because they play the 9 games. And so what happened last year with Indiana when they went to Iowa, I mean, it was just ugly and they got thumped. And this year you've got Illinois. The difference is you're at home as opposed to on the road. And Illinois is not a top 25 team, whereas certainly Iowa was. So that's going to be a big game. Friday night under the lights. It should be a lot of fun Labor Day weekend.